Hello, I'm Professor Paul Watanabe. I'm the chairman of the Political Science Department at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and also director here at the Institute for Asian American Studies. In talking about immigrants from Asia, I think in these brief remarks I want to emphasize three themes. One is longevity, the second is growth, and the third is diversity. And I want to discuss that as well in the context of something that at least I believe, that of all of the major racial and ethnic groups within the United States, I think probably less is known and taught about those immigrants from Asia than any other particular group. So it's with that in mind that I think a lot of the information and a lot of these themes about Asian Americans is particularly crucial because we have less understanding of this group, which is an important one, especially in the current framework, as we're going to point out in a minute, which is the fastest growing racial and ethnic group within the United States. So first of all, in terms of the theme of longevity, and this might surprise people, because there is a feeling that maybe our Asian immigrants from Asia are individuals who have sort of recently arrived and come on the scene. And we're going to find that there has been indeed a literal explosion of immigrants from Asia in the last few decades. But that doesn't mean that we haven't had in the United States immigrants from Asia for a long period of time. Indeed, they have been here in the United States for over 200 years. And even probably most notably, they came on the scene when we think about the large number of immigrants, particularly from China, who came in the mid-19th century, principally to places like California and in the West, seeking what they called Gold Mountain, working on things like the mines and the railroads. But there has been a long presence of Asian American immigrants in the United States, again going back as long as the history of this nation. The second theme, and that's the theme of the size and the growth of this particular community. In the United States now, there are over 16 million Americans who trace their ancestry to some Asian country. That represents about 5% of the population within the United States. And they are, as I have pointed out, they have become now the fastest growing major racial or ethnic group within the United States. And it's a rapid growth that we have seen. We've seen a tenfold increase, for example, in the Asian American population within the United States since just 1960. And indeed, in the decades after 1960, it was typical to see almost a doubling of the Asian American population every decade. That pace has slowed down a bit, but it has still continued. And indeed, in fact, Asian immigrants now surpass immigrants from any other part of the world, including the Western Hemisphere and Latin America. Asian immigrants are the largest now block of immigrants coming to the United States. And so the growth that I have talked about in this population, the tremendous growth, is one that unsurprisingly is one that is fed largely by immigration. The other theme that I wanted to develop, and I think perhaps the most critical one when people begin to study immigrants from Asia within the United States, is the theme of diversity. And with that theme of diversity comes its accompaniment, and that is an understanding of the complexity in trying to understand the Asian American community within the United States. For example, there is no such thing as just an Asian country. The Asian immigrants in the United States are as diverse as the large number of Asian countries that there are. Currently in the United States, for example, we have large representations from literally dozens of Asian groups within the United States. Right now, in order, the largest Asian group within the United States are the Chinese. The second largest are those from South Asian Indians. The third largest are Filipinos, the fourth Vietnamese, the fifth Koreans, and the sixth the Japanese. And we're seeing tremendous flux amongst many of these particular groups. For example, the Japanese, just as recently as 1970, were the largest Asian group within the United States. Now they're the sixth largest, and they are likely to even fall from the sixth position as we move on in the years ahead. So we're seeing change amongst these various Asian ethnic groups. There's also tremendous diversity in terms of nativity and citizenship within the Asian American community. The Asian American community is the one that is in fact the most heavily immigrant, meaning foreign born, than any group within the United States. Again, this surprises a lot of people when there was a lot of talk, for example, about the Latino or Hispanic group within the United States, and a lot of talk about them in terms of immigration and so forth. But in fact, Asian Americans, almost 70% of Asian Americans are foreign-born, meaning immigrants, and only about 30% are native-born, born here within the United States. And about half of those that are immigrants to the United States have become naturalized citizens in the United States. Another theme in terms of diversity is not only in terms of nativity and citizenship, not only in terms of their Asian ethnicities, but also in terms of their great socioeconomic diversity. Again, this is a surprise to many people because a lot of people might think that Asian Americans are thought of as this kind of undifferentiated monolithic group. But in fact, there is tremendous diversity even in terms of various kinds of socioeconomic indicators. For example, in terms of income, using whatever measure we use, median household income is commonly used, per capita income is commonly used. The fact is that you see very high levels of median household income amongst certain Asian subgroups. For example, Indian Americans, Korean Americans, for example, Japanese Americans have very high levels of median household income. Yet at the other end of the spectrum, you see some of the populations in the United States that have relatively low levels of income. The Southeast Asian populations, for example, the Cambodians, the Vietnamese, the Hmong populations, they are at close to the bottom rung of income distribution within the United States. And it again emphasizes the point that I've been trying to make, that in some ways, if we think of them in the aggregate, if we only look at them in aggregate, we miss this complexity that accompanies the diversity we've talked about. In terms of poverty rates, for example, once again, you have some of the lowest poverty rates of any groups within the United States amongst the Asian ethnic groups. And yet, amongst other Asian ethnic groups, you see some of the highest levels of poverty rates in the United States. Again, once again, emphasizing the notion that complexity is the best way to understand this group, and the best way to present the data and understand the data is not in an undifferentiated fashion, but in a disaggregated one. Educational attainment, again, this is an area that might surprise a lot of people who think that, for example, Asian Americans might be all well-educated valedictorians of their class, all doing well and successfully in educational pursuits. And you do see some high levels of educational attainment amongst Asian Americans broadly and within specific groups. But also, once again, you see low levels of educational attainment amongst other groups. Some of the groups, for example, have some of the highest levels of percentages of their population with less than a high school education can be found amongst certain Asian American ethnic groups. So once again, you get these broad bimodal, not unimodal distributions when you think about things like educational attainment. And as I pointed out, when you think about poverty rates, when you think about income. And of course, finally, this diversity and this complexity is reflected in the immigrant histories and stories of the various the groups. And here, in their treatment within the United States. And here you see ideas in which there are similarities, in which Asian Americans, again, despite these differences, often tend to get lumped together and treated the same way. And of course, differences between them over time. And this has been, again, the story that in some respects Asian Americans have been treated as an undifferentiated mass, even legally and politically, and yet at other times fine gradations have been made in terms of the way that they've been treated as individual Asian ethnic groups. And my point is that despite these numbers, despite this longevity, despite this growth, I think Asian Americans have been largely invisible. And that's why I think it is critical for us to once again cast our eyes on this group and try to understand them, not so much simply in terms of Asian Americans, but in fact, if we take a much more critical and careful look at them, we will see that they have played a very important part, not just in Asian American history, but American history much more broadly. Some of the ways which I want to that I think about it sort of typifying this and perhaps ending on this note. For example, recently I traveled out west to Utah, to Promontory Point, the place at which the Golden Spike was struck. uniting both directions, the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869. And I think, as many people know, if perhaps in no other way they understand about Asian Americans perhaps playing some role in the nation's history, they understand that perhaps there is something to do with the building of that Transcontinental Railroad and some aspects of the nation's Asian American immigrant community. And one thing that I remember from that scene that I went and sort of saw a reenactment of in Utah a few weeks ago is perhaps that famous scene that at least we see in many of our history books of the kind of the two trains coming together and the driving of the Golden Spike, uniting the nation together from east to west by railroad. And there's a famous shot at that particular moment where there are literally dozens of people crowding around those trains celebrating that particular moment. This is one of those iconic scenes that we see of that particular celebration. But the interesting thing about that picture, and I've looked at it carefully, even with a microscope, with a telescope, with a microscope, the fact is that there's not a single Chinese American face amongst all of those hundreds there. Now, why would that be unusual? Well, it'd be unusual because 90% of the labor, the people who actually built that railroad in the most treacherous direction, from west to east, were Chinese Americans. Chinese American laborers are the ones, not the Leland Stanfords of the world that we often think about, but the people, the workers who actually toiled and built that railroad were Chinese Americans. And yet in this great moment, this triumphant moment, this historic moment, when they're attempting to capture this moment, there are no Chinese Americans within that scene. There's nobody in the picture. And in some ways, I think it's symbolic of the invisibility that I'm talking about. And sort of one final measure of this. A lot of people that study immigrant history, perhaps some of the people who are in this particular course will look at a book, a famous book by Oscar Hanlon, a Harvard historian, called The Uprooted. And this Uprooted, indeed the full title of the book, The Uprooted, I believe is the epic account of the great migrations that made the American people. This for many, many years, indeed decades, the standard immigrant text that talked about the immigrant roots of this, what we call nation of immigrants. And yet, if you looked at this particular book, this epic account, there was hardly a word about the immigrants who came across the Pacific. It is filled with stories about those who came across the Atlantic and settled and went through Ellis Island in New York Harbor. There was hardly a word about those immigrants who came across the Pacific, that other ocean, and went through Angel Island in San Francisco Harbor. That's why, for example, University of California professor Ronald Takaki, in order to kind of set the story straight, decided to write his own book about that migration, about those immigrants who came across the Pacific and not across the Atlantic. And I think it's interesting and instructive what he named his book. He titled his book, Strangers from a Different Shore. Strangers from a Different Shore is what they were in terms of the history and the retelling of the immigrant story within the United States. And hopefully, with the discussions in this seminar and with the discussions that you will take to your students and that you will take and the readings and the discussions you will have, the Asian American immigrant population will be strangers no more. Thank you.